So tonight I wanted to talk about no self. So you're very brave to show up at all for a talk about no self. It's one of the three Buddhist sort of fundamental characteristics about life. The other two are more accessible. So the other two are impermanence and just a sense of unsatisfactoriness. The Sanskrit word that's translated is often translated as suffering, but it's not abject suffering that we're talking about in most cases. It's just a sense of something not quite right, something could be better. In current Western terminology, it might be similar in a sense to the sense of midlife crisis, where we are suddenly confronted by the thought, is this all there is? Just that sense of something just doesn't feel quite right. So I'd like to talk about the two easy ones first, then we'll talk about no self. So impermanence is probably obvious. Everything in the world of form has a lifespan. It comes, it goes, and for some period of time, it is present as an identifiable named feature in the world of form. It might be a human body, it might be a mountain, it might be a moth. These have different lifespans, but they're all have this common impermanent characteristic: birth, life, and receding back into the formless mass by which other forms are created. So this is obvious. There's different lifespans, but they all have this similar characteristic. So this isn't difficult to understand. It's part of life. And it's usually taken, when it's spoken of, it can be taken as a unfortunate thing, like, it's really too bad life's impermanent. Like it's somehow a cause for despondency. But seen in another way, it's sort of necessary for life itself. I mean, if an acorn, for example, wasn't impermanent, we wouldn't have any oak trees. I mean, there needs to be this movement of life to keep it sustained. So the second leg of this three characteristics of existence in Buddhist thought is the sense of unsatisfactoriness. And it doesn't have to be overt. It can be more like the sense of something not quite right, sort of the sense of a ill-fitting shoe, some sort of discomfort that may be seen more as anxiety or worry, somehow, being challenged by life, sense of discomfort. And again, this is often taken in negative terms, suffering, but without this sense of unsatisfactoriness, there really wouldn't be a movement to do anything different. It's actually that same sense that drove Siddhartha, before he became the Buddha, drove Siddhartha out of his princely comfort zone, out into the wilderness. That sense of something's not quite right, I need to get to the bottom of this. That sense of sort of dissatisfaction with how one is perceiving things. Okay, so those were the two easy ones. The third leg is a little more challenging because it sounds off-putting, this idea of no self. It's like, just on the face of it, it doesn't sound like a good idea to even go down that road to ponder. I mean, if we take ourselves to be this separate individual organism, and someone suggests that, well, that's just an illusion, you're really not that, and you should try to be something more authentic, it just doesn't sound like a good idea, right? And it doesn't sound easy either. It feels like the equivalent of trying to run away from your own shadow. Like, how would you even go about doing that? How would you sort of step away from everything that you take yourself to be? This sense of meanness, this ego, the personal sense of personal identity. In this country, that's highly valued. Being your own person, making your own way, is very highly valued. And it's supported by everything in our culture and our advertisements, and by the fact that nearly everyone believes that it's, well, true. It's not even open to discussion. It's so true that it doesn't even require inquiry. But one thing that, well, the Buddhists are good at a number of things, but one thing that they're especially good at is not taking anything on faith. Just because it's an idea that to be believed, they're much more about the ability of us humans to actually investigate it for ourselves and come to our own conclusions about it, based on the premises that what we truly are is discoverable by ourself. We're not dependent on an intermediary. We're not dependent on someone, between us and the divine, somebody to go to bat for us. It's discoverable by deep inquiry into our own nature. So in that sense, it's quite scientific. It's quite logical, and logical in the sense that there's a willingness to go wherever that trail leads. So with that spirit of sort of inquiring directly into the nature of our existence, then the question is, what is it really that's living this life? What's enlivening these forms? What is that? There's an undeniable sense of self, of me, of being present here now in this moment. So we don't have to pretend that it's not. We don't have to try to convince ourselves, try to hypnotize ourselves. It's like, no, we can acknowledge that sense of being present in ourselves here and now is an undeniable fact of life. The tricky part comes when we conclude that is personal. So that's what I want to look into. Okay, so there's basically two pathways that we experience, well, everything. One pathway is through our five senses, our sense of sight and hearing and taste and touch and smell. Those five senses. So this is how we sense into what's happening in the immediate environment. But we wouldn't say that that sound that I hear is what I am, right? There's an ability to perceive it, but we wouldn't conclude that, therefore, that's what I am. There's a sense of what I am has this ability to perceive it, right? So it's not in the sensing capacity itself. It's something more fundamental than that. So if it were in the sensing capacity itself, if we lost our hearing, let's say, our sense of self would be somehow diminished. But that's not the case. When we get COVID and lose our taste for some period of time, it doesn't feel like our sense of self has taken a hit. It may be unpleasant. You may not like it, but it doesn't, it doesn't diminish our sense of being here as a me somehow. So I'm suggesting that it doesn't have anything to do with this sense of self isn't housed in any of those perception capacities, any of those senses that we have as humans. Okay, so the other pathway, it's actually just another way of slicing and dicing, but the other pathway in Buddhism is called the five skandhas, five aggregates, but they're the form of the body, there's perception, there's feelings, there's mental activity, and there's consciousness. So let's deal with the two easy ones first. Two easy ones are perception and feelings. So feelings, we all know that they come and go and change all the time. Sometimes they're massively in our face, sometimes they're quite subtle. But with that degree of transiency, it's not something that we can claim is our firm home, our foundation. Our sense of being rests in the feeling, because the feelings are always in flux. And the same is true with perception. Perception is based on what's happening in our environment. What's happening in our environment is always changing, and so our perceptions are always changing. So again, with that level of impermanence, it's not something that we want to bet the farm on. Okay, so let's deal with the more difficult ones. One is the sense of form. So if we look down and we can see this form, we can see the body, we can touch it, we can feel it. We can feel it from, our hands on the outside of the body. We can sense into it internally. There's this sense of this form being something solid in a sense, something clearly present and separated from the rest of existence by our skin. This side of my skin is me. That side is everything else. Clear demarcation. Right. But the only way we know that we even have a body is because we can see it, we can touch it, we can sort of scratch it, we can feel the indigestion, we can feel the ache in our knees. But those are all, again, perceptions, something appearing within our capacity of awareness. So it's interesting and actually instructive to note that there was a time in our life, the first year of our life, where we didn't have this sense of me as a separate body, right? Like a newborn baby, very much engaged with its surroundings, aware of its surroundings, but it hasn't yet concluded that I am separate from my experience. There's what we later learn is an experience of outside circumstances, mom, dad, the sparkly things above the crib, doting aunts and uncles, all of that happening. But we don't say, well, that's not me, that's outside of me. We haven't made that philosophical distinction yet. It's just all happening. And same with the internal sensations. We may have a full belly, we may be hungry, we may be wet, we may be tired, and that may be expressed, but there's not an associated thought that I am feeling hungry, I am feeling wet. There's just a sense of discomfort. It's not me feeling discomfort. So there's the experience, but there's not the sense of I am the one having this experience. That sounds like a really fine philosophical difference, but it is huge if we're talking about liberation versus bondage, right? So this first year of life that we all got to experience was, in a sense, living in the state of grace, in a state of where experience was happening fully, but it wasn't me having the experience. There wasn't a personal sense of self. There was just experience. The sense of separate personal self was learned later in this lifetime. We weren't born with it. None of us. Right? It was learned. We first were told what our names were, that were different from other people's names. We're told when we were good or bad or right or wrong, and how society worked, and so on and so on. And after a while, what we learned was important was not this sort of spacious awareness of everything. What was important was the seemingly objective physical world. That's what counted. And me, in this body, this side of my skin, was a sort of little vulnerable organism in a big, wide, objective, external world. That's the paradigm that we learned. And it was reinforced, like I said before, by everything else in society supported it, to the extent that if you questioned it, it was odd, weird, not to be trusted. So that's where we find ourselves. To say that it is the body that counts, it's not the body itself that's insisting I am a separate personal self. I am apart from the rest of existence. That the body isn't doing that. There's some vital organs in here that, can be removed or replaced or upgraded in some way. And yet there's still this sense of self. It's not dependent on the body. The body isn't insisting on its own separateness. So that leaves us with mental activity, right? That's where I think most of us would say, well, that feels closer to home. That's really what I take myself to be. I think, therefore I am. I have opinions, I have beliefs, I have a storyline, I have hopes, I have dreams, I have fears. This is who I am. And it feels, because there is that memory of past and a presumed continuity, and there is this undeniable sense of self, those two things get married. So we come to believe that what I am is this composite set of beliefs and assumptions that I am a separate individual organism, apart from everything else. So it's really in this mental functioning that where we really have to look carefully. But what we can see there also is that these thoughts are arising largely on their own when we're not involved in directive kind of thinking, when we're just sort of on autopilot, discursive thinking. Those thoughts arise, and they're not arising under our control. They're just arising, and we're aware of the thoughts. And this can become especially obvious when we try to sit in meditation and try to control those thoughts and find out quickly that we can't. In fact, when we try to control the thoughts, they often get more intense, more chaotic sometimes. So the other characteristic about thought is that it also changes over the course of a lifetime. What we believe now isn't the same things that we believed when we were teenagers. And that changes over the course of time. So again, if the beliefs change, if the thoughts arise on their own, is that really where this sense of personal self resides? And if it is in the sense of thinking, what happens when we stop thinking, if even for a moment? As can sometimes happen, or it can happen at random times, but sometimes during meditation, sometimes when we're just walking around and I'm surprised by something. Mind stops for just a moment. If what we are is dependent on thought, then if the mind stops, who would we be? Right, so that's a huge clue that what we truly are isn't dependent on this mental functioning. So where that leaves us is consciousness, right? Awareness, which is what is aware of the thinking stream, aware of feelings, perceptions, aware of the fact that this body is here, aware of the functions of our sense organs. So this awareness, since it doesn't come and go, our attention may be directed elsewhere, but the awareness is always present. We may not be aware of it, but it is aware of wherever our attention lies. So the fact that it's not coming and going like everything else, the fact that it's formless, which also means that it was never born into this world of form, it's of a fundamentally different character. So we can begin to suspect that perhaps that is where this deepest sense of self resides, as awareness, as this formless spaciousness. Now we can still conclude like it's my awareness. That's where my personal self resides, and my awareness. Right? So that's another level of investigation. Like, is it my awareness? The assumption that somehow it's being generated by this body-mind. But we don't actually know that. The other possibility is that this awareness exists. And within that capacity of being knowingly present for everything, this whole life unfolds within it. So we can begin to inquire about the nature of this awareness if we can see that the sense of self is most likely, let's say, housed or resident in as the sense of formless awareness. Then we can inquire as to the character of it, as to the implications of that recognition. And what we may discover is that it is not personal. It's the one awareness functioning through and as this form. It looks like this here, functioning through and as your form, your body-mind. It looks as you do. And so the one awareness, as it functions through your sensory capacities, feels like it's located in that vicinity, because that's where the sense organs are located, right? Over here, it feels like it's located in this vicinity. And yet, when we really look, we can see that that awareness is without bounds. And because it's without bounds and without attributes, one awareness is not different than another. It's not that one awareness ends and another begins. It's the one awareness, same awareness. So the perhaps disappointing news is that there is no personal separate self. But when we truly embrace that recognition for ourselves through our own direct investigation, what we also find is, yes, there's no individual personal self, but there is this immense self, the one awareness. So no personal individual separate self with a little s, but yes, there's a big S, self, that sense of ultimate subjectivity, that capacity to be aware of whatever appears within that field of awareness. And you are that.